So thank you all so much for coming today. First, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this evening. Jessica H. Stone, or Jess as we know her, is the author of Blood on a Blue Moon, a Sheaffer Blue Mystery, The Last Outrageous Woman, and Doggy on Deck. She collects fountain pens and lives in a small town by the sea. So please join me in welcoming Jess Stone.
Hi, Claire. Hello, writers, readers out there. It's always a delight to work with Village Books. And I am especially honored this evening because I get to have a conversation with one of my favorite mentors and writers, Jack Remick. So first, before I introduce Jack, I want to introduce his latest book. And Jack is very prolific, so you have to really pay attention because his books are coming out. This one is What Do I Know? Wisdom Essays. And I'd just like to read a little bit about this set of essays. And this was written by Priscilla Long, who is the author of Fire and Stone and also a phenomenal teacher and phenomenal poet in our community. And Priscilla writes, the intensity and depth of Jack Remick's reflection on wisdom go beyond brilliant, original, mind-bending. The searching questions in these essays are quintessential to our fraught times, and they set off my own convoluted thoughts about wisdom. What is it? Do I have it? What do I know? And What Do I Know is one of those books that will be read and reread, discussed, thought over and over again, and read again. Its lucidity will reverberate. So about Jack Remick. Jack is a writer's writer. He is a master at prose, at poetry, at novels, and even at screenplays. Writing is his art. He is also a master teacher. And I have been so lucky to be studying with Jack Remick for actually years, but very intensely during these last 2 years. And at one point when I was struggling a great deal with what seemed like the futility of it all, I asked Jack what I should do. And he told me to keep working. He said, keep working, Jess, because art is our salvation. And with that, I'd like to introduce master teacher and writer, Jack Remick.
Hello,
Hi, Jack.
Jessica. That was lovely. I really enjoy introductions like that. I sometimes say, I wonder who she's talking about. But I know you know. So how are you doing?
I'm doing well. And yourself?
Okay, yeah, doing all right.
Oh, great. Well, Jack, I've introduced your book here, and I wanted to know, you in your wisdom essays, you wrote about a time in the beginning when not everyone wrote. We have a lot of writers today, but not everyone wrote. So I ask you, why this book at this time?
Well, that's a good question. Fundamentally, it started when I did writing practice with a lot of writers at Louisa's. And of course, I have grandchildren. I'm now that age. And I kept wondering to myself, well, what can I possibly teach my grandchildren? So I thought, well, I'll teach them about money. So I gave them a bank they had to dial up, and I gave them a few bucks and had them put it in that. And then when they got 20 bucks, I had them open an account. And one day, Alex is at the computer. He says, Grandpa, I need a credit card. I said, why do you need a credit card, Alex? And he said, well, I'm on Amazon and they won't send me these things unless I have a card. And I realized at that moment that even though he's 8, he's already gone beyond everything that I thought I could tell him. So as I wrote the essays, I began to ask myself, well, if I can't talk to my grandkids, who can I talk to? And what do I know that anybody would want to know? The whole question of wisdom then sort of became the focus. And every essay that I wrote started with the same words. What is wisdom? How do I get it? How do I know I have it? How do I know I don't have it? So that became the focus of those essays. And as I wrote them, I opened up, as you often do in writing practice, that is timed writing under a clock, a la Natalie Goldberg. One thing leads to another, and I realized that I was working pretty much in the time asking questions that just about everybody at the table was asking. What is writing? What is art? What am I doing here? And so I started putting it all together, writing 1-2 essays a week for about a year. That's how the book came into being at this time. Fortunately, politics did interfere, or unfortunately, politics did interfere, but I kept writing. And one of the essays about this time is in the essay called The Arrogance of the Princely Mind, which is kind of a portrait of you-know-who and the disruption and the terror and the ugliness that came out of that particular election in 2016.
Wow. Yeah. We won't mention that name out loud. I think we have an agreement.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because that particular essay came out in one of the Raven Chronicles anthologies, and we read from it over at Chris Jarmick's bookstore in Kirkland, and everybody read, and I got up and I just laid it out, and Chris at the end said, well, we really didn't hear very much about him until this last reader. So I knew I had gotten too deep into politics in that essay. But that's, to me, is one of the most important pieces in the book.
Well, I'm going to move on from politics a little bit, because we
Okay.
could get into a big kerfuffle about that. So let's move on. But sticking with our times and the times in which we live, I mean, obviously we are still in a very painful period of time. And we struggle a lot right now. And one of the essays, as I was reading your book and reading the essays before the book came out, that you talked about forgetting and the wisdom of forgetting, and how forgetting plays a role in our very survival. And one of the lines that I just love, you wrote, "I float on a sea of forget."
Right.
And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the wisdom of forgetting.
Okay. My sister has done a lot of genealogy work, trying to figure out where the families came from and all that. Before that, I had a pretty clear notion that most people cannot go back past their great-grandfather. And if they can hit the great-grandfather, they probably do not remember their great-grandmother's name. So I looked at this and I thought, my goodness, for 2 million years, I know nothing about anybody except the last 3 generations. So they're all forgotten. And so I got this idea of forget in deep time, the forgetfulness that we use as a way to escape from having to ask the questions, where do we come from? What are we doing here? You know, all the usual things. But the sea of forget is something that I kind of picked up from a professor named Jarvis Bastian when I was at Davis. And he talked about the window of consciousness. And then he talked about the window of consciousness being about 1 inch wide. And the rest of it is stuff you don't even know about. I write in several places about how we do things all the time with the autonomic system, the parasympathetic system. You can't control so many things. And so I also thought then, well, we can't really control the past. It's forgotten to us. Once we reach a certain point, it is forgotten. So what that means is, you've heard it a lot, the 5 stages of grief, or is it the 7 stages of grief? After a while, you do begin to forget. So forgetting can be a very curative kind of process in your own mind, because you're not constantly reminded, or those events from the past that were painful are not constantly brought up into consciousness. So the sea of forget is all that stuff you have no idea about from the past, even from the present, stuff in your own mind.
Mhm. That's kind of on the order of time heals all wounds.
Yeah.
Time allows us to forget.
Yeah.
Jack, would you mind reading a little bit about that? I'm looking at this essay and looking at it, page 158. I was wondering if you could read a little bit
Sure.
about forgetting.
Let me see if I can find it. I like a lot of writers. Once I write it, I don't remember it. I don't remember where it came from. I don't remember people say, oh, that was really nice. I don't even remember writing it. That's also one of the terrible things, at the same time, a wonderful thing about writing practice, because you're actually pulling stuff from not from the consciousness, not from the conscious, but from the unconscious mind. So the idea of silence became very important to me as I wrote these essays. So here's a piece that I like is there. To be silent does not negate opinion or knowledge, but it does measure the width of wisdom through time. When the I realizes the insignificance of self-aggrandizement, I ask myself as I listen to the other speak, will my experience enhance, enrich, add to, or detract from their now? I usually come away with a no. No is the biggest word of all, knowing when the negative has more force than the positive, knowing when to say nothing, which is also a way to say no, is the most fruitful limb of wisdom.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. You also talk, and you've talked to your students a great deal about this. As creatives, we know that everything that we do informs our work. You take a ferry ride, and somewhere in the back of your mind that clicks in. You have lunch, and it clicks in somewhere. So that's everything we do as creatives informs our work. So I was wondering if you could reflect on a little bit how this study of wisdom reflects on your other work, because you are continuing to write other books.
Yeah. Well, I think one way to answer a question like that is to answer the question when people say, how long did it take you to write this book? And I've thought about that. And I say, well, each one took me an entire lifetime, because not only as you talk about, you are experiencing things in real time, but you're also experiencing everything you've ever read. You're experiencing the mistakes you made. So I use that as kind of the summary. I am the sum of all my mistakes. And that idea shows up in the novels, it shows up in the poetry, the idea that it takes a lifetime to become a writer. There is no time when I am not reading, learning something that eventually in some way or another will show up in one of the books, one of the novels, especially the work of writers and thinkers like Vladimir Propin, the structure of the folk tale, or Levi-Strauss mythologies, or people like that, Jung, his notions about the unconscious. So as I read, and the more I know, the more proficient I become at interlacing other experiences into my own in such a way to bring forth things that I hope people have not seen before, have not heard before. One of my ways I teach writers is, if you're going to imitate everything that everybody else has done, you're not going to be very large. And I got that notion from Tom Gunn, who was a poet at Berkeley, friend of Ted Hughes, a friend of Sylvia Plath. And I was imitating everybody under the sun, Wordsworth, Byron. I can still quote a lot of the Byron poetry. And he took me aside after I had written a little poem called Ode to Kepler. And he said, Jack, when you live in another man's universe, it will always be smaller than the one you create for yourself. So how did I take that? What I took that to be is quit writing about myself and start writing about the I that sees the culture. And so all of those things try to flow into my work. I was working the other day with somebody, and I remember with Larry Christ, we read poems back and forth. And I read him a scene from The Deification where Eddie, the protagonist, has come out of burning down his house, watching his father die. He goes on a 3-day or 10-day toot, and he's reciting poetry as he walks around San Francisco. And then on the 11th day, he came awake. And so what I have there is, in Jungian terms, that's a descent into the unconscious. It's a descent into the underground. And that's how my writing helps me connect to the other minds of writers who have gone before me. Natalie Goldberg in her classes is fond of saying mind connects to mind. And that's very interesting because it gets us into the notion of speech, to the notion of writing. You mentioned earlier before we wrote, well, Berwick and Chomsky in a book called Why Only Us, saying, why of all the primates are we the only one that can speak? Well, other primates can communicate, but as far as I know, no chimpanzee has written a history of the race. We try to do that every time. So that's a long-winded way around avoiding answering your question, Jessica, but I gave it a shot.
Well, that brings up two things, but as far as speaking, there is that duck in Australia that can speak. Do you know what I'm talking about? He says, anyway, never mind. There's a duck that can talk, but forget that. But on a more serious note, a more relevant perhaps, you mentioned Jung a couple times in your discussion there, and I was wondering if you could talk about myth in our language and myth in our storytelling.
Yeah. Well, myth is a very powerful thing in human beings. There's a huge amount of writing about mythology, about myths. And there's some question about the mytheme, which is a Levi-Straussian notion that parts of myths travel through time. And if you start looking at the way we write and you analyze what's going on, you will see that your writing is embedded or is really thick with archetypes. And a lot of people don't want to talk about archetypes, but Jung says they're very, very few. So one of the things that comes up in writing is, well, Ibsen used to say in his place, he said, if you know you're dealing with a symbol, it's not a symbol. See, symbol is something you don't understand that you're dealing with. So what happens is we write, we do things, somebody comes along and says, oh, that's like this, that, or the other thing. This is like a myth. So what you're finding, you have to realize that we brought a lot of stuff with us 10,000 years ago, 260,000 years ago when we came out of Africa and it went around. What did we keep that shows up in our mind today? Levi-Strauss is pretty clear, and he says that we are all living in mythic time all the time. Well, what does that mean? Let me give you an example of something. Somebody says, oh, I don't write archetypes. I don't write myth, And I say, okay, I'm going to tell you a story. There's this guy, he gets shipwrecked on an island. He's on the island alone with himself for a while, and he discovers or runs across a wise man who knows the secrets of nature and is going to teach him how to do it. And I say, okay, what story did I just tell you? And everybody says, oh, well, that's Robinson Crusoe. I say, no, I was telling you the story of Architect and the Emperor of Syria, played by Fernando Arrabal, who's a Spanish playwright writing in French. Well, there's quite a distance between Robinson Crusoe and the Architect and the Emperor of Assyria, but the archetypes are there, the myth is there, but the myth as they write it is cloaked in two things. It's cloaked in the time of clothing. It's dressed in the time, and it is set in time. So archetypes and their mythic components don't exist as such until you clothe them and put them in time. Is that an answer?
Yes, it is.
I don't know if that's an answer or not. But I find, let me give you another example. Every writer I know who has read a lot always winds up explaining or revealing the myth base in the story. Now, a myth base does not mean that it's a recognizable Greek transformation, a Roman transformation of a Greek story. You know, what this means, it's a structure in the mind that comes out in the unconscious mode and gets dressed and put in time. I don't know how many of our viewers or listeners have seen the first Manchurian Candidate with Frank Sinatra and Lawrence Harvey. Well, there's a marvelous scene in there in the movie, have to go to the movie first, where the two characters are together at Christmas and they're both getting kind of drunk, and one of them, Lawrence Harvey character, is complaining, and he complains and moans about his mother. And he says, "Oh, I didn't ask you here. You don't want to hear me complain about my mother." Captain Marco, played by Frank Sinatra, says, "Oh no, it's like listening to Orestes complain about Clytemnestra." And you say, "What? What do you mean?" So what he did, he reveals the myth base right there. What he reveals is a myth of Orestes coming back from the Trojan War. The Harvey character is a hero coming back from the Korean War. He finds that his father's dead, and his mother is living with the fake father. So the character does two things. He kills the mother and he kills the lover, which is exactly what Orestes did. He kills Clytemnestra and he kills Aegisthus. Now, that does not appear in Condon's novel. The structure does, but the writer does not reveal the myth base. The screenwriter saw it and he put it in words, put it in images. So what this showing, is that we think we're such wonderfully creative individual writers, but really we've got a load of humanity writing on each word.
Wow. You know what? That is a perfect time for me to read one of our questions to you, because it kind of addresses it. It tags onto there. This is from a dear friend of yours, Priscilla Long. Okay. And she says, "How did you structure the essays? Are they structured similarly?" Which they are. And when in the process did you understand what the structure would be? It's very linked, I think, to what you've been talking about.
Yeah, well, the answer to that question is inherent in the notion of timed writing. See, Bob Ray and I, when we worked together, we took Natalie Goldberg's ideas about timed writing and said, well, what if you do things in this way? So we said, well, we'll write 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 5. That's a time structure. So time gives you structure. And if you watch what happens in structure, your mind eventually will say, I've got to have had this. I got to have this happening at 10 minutes, at 15 minutes, at 20 minutes. So when I wrote the essays, we were at that time writing in 45-minute segments. And I had read a lot of memoirs from the 18th, 19th century. I had read a lot of memoirs from the 20th century because we Bob and I led a class on writing memoir. So I had a pretty good idea of what was happening. And I understood this. I'm going to use 15-minute segments for the structure of this story, each essay. But in that, I have to connect to the other minds from the past who have given me these things. And one of the writers that I connected to closest was Montaigne, because Montaigne has the habit of starting out an essay like Les Cannibales or Les Coches, carriages or cannibals. And he starts writing about carriages or cannibals, but 5 minutes in, he's writing about social structure, women and being left out of society, mathematics, everything. So you follow the mind. So what I had to do when I wrote the essays was use the times writing structure, 15, 15, 15, and let my mind flow over those things. So I was able to connect in the writing with my past, bringing new things out. So the structure is in the time. When you put names on the structure, you can then wind up with very dramatic kinds of devices, I would call it. Bob and I use something called the Mythic Journey. All the writers who've worked with us know about the Mythic Journey. Once we attach time to structure, then we limit it without any kind of false ideas. Okay. I mean, if you read somebody like Sid Field, his screenplay, he says, oh, at page 30, this is going to happen, page 60, page 90. Well, that's kind of a prescription that gets in the way of the unconscious flow of information that is in your head that you're bringing out under the clock. Okay, so Priscilla will let me know if I answered that question.
So we're saying that you can use, or I'm hearing you saying that you can use the timed writing for across all the genres, right? Across
Yes.
memoir,
Yes.
novel, thriller,
Yes.
all of them. You can use that as a way to start your structure, right?
Yes. Well, when every novel that I have written, every novel, I mean, this is not an if, you know, an approximate, every novel I have written under the clock. I have written in the beginning, we sat at the table and only wrote for 30 minutes, but gradually through time, we upped it to 40 and then to 45 minutes. And our writers continued to use this as a way to finish off their own stories by realizing that time is structure. You absolutely get control. No, I can't say it that way. The unconscious allows you to think you've taken control of this device, but you haven't. You have fed information into your unconscious mind with everything you've ever read, and it's eking itself out in 5-minute segments or 10-minute segments or 15-minute segments. This is one of the great discoveries about the mind and writing that Natalie Goldberg gave us in Writing Down the Bones and Savage Mind. Those books actually show us a way. Now, what Bob and I did was, in fact, to take the timed writing notion and ascribe dramatic elements to it. Now, that is kind of a leap, but that's how our creativity managed to insert itself into the timed writing. Whereas Natalie just thought that, you know, writing practice is a structure. But we thought, well, it is, but it's not sufficient. So every novel that Bob wrote, every novel that I wrote, I hope that, you know, in my old age, I forget names. Well, Pamela, I hope Pamela Carter is in there. She knows about that because she used timed writing to write plays. Okay.
Okay.
Priscilla used timed writing to write her essays. So, okay, I think that's enough on that.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit? I'm going to jump to a different book just because I absolutely love it. Okay. But can you talk a little bit about the structure behind Citadel? And for people who don't know Citadel, run right out and get it today.
Okay. Yeah. Well, Citadel was a very hard novel to get hold of, in the sense of for me to begin to work it again. Because when I wrote the first draft several years ago, I realized something about writing. We often have ideas that far outstrip our technique as writers to render. Okay, you get an idea and say, wow, that's a great idea, but you just don't have the strength of writerness to take it from idea to paper to structure. Well, I found that with Citadel. So there are actually 2 novels in it. The first novel is the outer novel, 2 women, one of them is a book editor, one of them is a writer. They get together and then they discover that the writer has herself a novel that she wants the reader to do. So we have a novel within a novel as the basic structure. But that novel was also written in 30-minute segments. So there are scenes upon scenes upon scenes. Scenes have particular structures. The way I think, well, Bob and I solved, let me back up one step. Bob and I wrote a book called The Mystery, Weekend Novelist Writes a Mystery. And what we did there was lay out ways to approach writing mystery. It's still in print, by the way. And we were talking and talking, we said, well, where do we start when we write scenes? What do we do? And we sat down with a pencil and paper. I think we were up in Canada at that time. And we finally realized that timed writing, well, it opens doors that wouldn't be ordinarily opened. And I'm losing my train of thought. That's too big a thought for me to even try to
Okay.
That's just too big.
Well, actually, I was just thinking about that whole process in the timed writing and wondering how you, when you're doing this and you've got all this stuff coming in, how do you finish a piece? And it reminded me of your essay on finishing. And I was wondering if you would read from that, because it kind of addresses some of these things. What I'm looking at is page 178, and it says, I know this to finish brings me a sense of joy.
Yeah, okay. I know this to finish brings me a sense of joy. If I begin a piece, I start with the situation. Let me get a light here, Jessica. I know this to finish brings me a sense of joy. If I begin a piece, I start with emotion, feeling, or a sense of place. Now I can answer the question that we asked earlier. What we found was that scenes start with places. It's almost an existential, anthropological discovery that first there are places, then there are people. Places, people come into the places, they start asking people questions, they start fighting, they're looking for the resource base, but it always starts with a place. Now that does not mean necessarily that's what your reader sees first, but that's the way you write the scene. Place, time, character, dialogue, action, myth, all of those things. That's the structure. Let me finish this now. If I begin a piece, I start with emotion, feeling, or a sense of place. Then I imagine an ending. Without the ending, I have no sense of direction, no sense of purpose, only a sense of going nowhere. To see an ending is to suggest 100 beginnings, 100 forks, 1,000 choices. If then becomes the guide. If I do this, then my characters must do that. If then is a chain of guideposts of mile markers along the way. If I have an ending in mind, then I can move from place to place on a line of subplots off the main line, but always aimed at the ending, which might not be the ending you see at the beginning. Implicit in this process is change and the idea of obstacle. No story moves in a straight line except a dreadfully boring one. So the wisdom of finishing suggests that the beginning can be found. In this idea, I developed the notion of the walk back through time. It works this way. You have a beginning, a moment in time. You ask yourself what happened 5 minutes, 1 hour, 1 week, 1 month, 1 year, 4 years before the opening. This implies that the logic of the ending is in every beginning is already an ending.
That's lovely. That's really lovely. It reminds me of so many things. In everything that we begin, we are also beginning and ending.
Correct, correct.
Yes.
Bob and I seem to think about this in a way, and I have to relate it to, believe it or not, to Bruce Springsteen. Let me close up and get some light here. Okay. Bob and I realized that every crime novel, every detective novel starts with the end of a caper of some kind. Say the guy walks in and finds the bank's been robbed. Well, you got to find the guy who robbed it, you got to find why, you got to find witnesses, you got to confront the guy, and you finally arrest him. Well, all the time that you're doing that, you're just discovering in reverse what the caper guy did to get there. He had to find what he needed. He had to find his own means. He had to get all the people together. He had to do that. So the beginning of a novel, a crime novel, is in fact the ending of a caper novel. And that's a hard one to wrap your mind around, but it's really very, very true, very clear.
Sure. If you find the body, that means that's the beginning of it, but somebody's life is at the end.
Yeah,
it's the end of the crime, and that becomes a new thing. And that's a great way to look at it. Yeah.
Most people don't see the crime novel itself, the detective novel, as the caper novel in reverse. I mean,
can you give us a little bit more about that then?
Okay, you find a body, and one of the examples that Bob uses is a body in the library. You walk in, you find a body in the library. Well, you have to find out who could have killed her, who were the people who didn't like her. And the thing about the victim is they always got too close to the killer, right?
Mhm.
Okay, so she didn't just wind up dead there by chance, right? Somebody had an idea that she had something they wanted, so they work this curve in the back and get the back until they get her alone when they kill her. You see, I mean, and I'm talking about Agatha Christie's body in the library.
Sure.
See, but it doesn't matter. And this is one of the things that, to be a mystery novelist in this day and age, with what is known about structure and time and screenplay and what screenplay does to us, you really have to be creative. Let's drop for a minute. You mentioned in one of our sessions some time ago that you'd been reading Jack Reacher novels, like Lee Child novels. And I said, well, he's just a knight errant saving young women who are in trouble. He's wearing an army or this uniform, but he's still the archetype of the knight errant, the big guy. So you really have to be creative, given that so much is already known by so many people about these other art forms, which gets me to the notion of the screenplay. We worked for a couple of years, well, 10 years, something like that, in the screenwriting program at UW. And what we found was that screenwriting is nothing more, nothing less than an intelligence test. How much do I have to give you before you get it? See, now the highly detailed novel gives you way too much. They don't leave anything for you to discover on your own. All right, so screenwriting really taught us a lot about writing, I can tell you for sure. Citadel would not be the novel it is if I hadn't taken the screenwriting course. In fact, Citadel actually ends with a movie. Yeah, anyway.
Well, I'm glad that you took that class, because Citadel's a marvelous novel. Not an easy read, but a marvelous read. Yeah. You know what, Jack, we have time for one more thing that I wanted to ask you, and then we have a question by Janet Oakley, and I'm going to let Claire ask that question of you. But let me ask this, because it's something I've been wondering about, and I want you to talk about it, if you would. Ours is a very, very noisy world. Right. I mean, we have so much coming at us at all times. It's quite hard to hold a thought. And you wrote that wisdom is often crippled by the speed of knowledge, but to slow and reflect requires silence. And I wondered if you could just address briefly the wisdom of silence.
Briefly, huh? You want me to answer a question briefly? I'm not sure that's in the genes.
I'm sorry.
But I'll try this.
Shot, yeah.
Okay. What I know is that everything I know is actually carrying forward something that I've picked up from somebody else. In other words, there are books that I read through time that I took the time to read. And some of them were very, very long books. Some of them are very complex books. But I did not depend on a 30-second time, sound bite. I did not settle for a paragraph of something on a blog post. And I went into Levi-Strauss. I went into Jung. I went into C.S. Peirce. What are these guys talking about? And I realized that what they're trying to do is, without the tools that we have today, figure out what's going on in the black box called the brain. Now, the MRI, the functional MRI, gives us an opportunity to peer inside the brain to see what's happening. All right. So if you do not take the time and the silence and the quiet to absorb the culture that you exist in, your writing is always going to be very thin. Okay. So by chance, I am deaf. It's just, I have hearing, minimal hearing. I wear special hearing aids. And when I take those hearing aids out in the morning when I'm working, I live in a silence that is so pure and so beautiful that I can actually spend time in other people's minds. All right. I just finished a review of Pam Carter's novel, Held Together by Tape and Glue. But I read that at 3 o'clock in the morning, no hearing aids, just letting it go over me. And in the process, made associations from her work to the things that I know that have been brought forward in time. So silence for me becomes an absolute necessity for the creative process, because we live, when I open the windows to my house, I hear airplanes going over, I hear cars going over, but what I don't hear is the silence of a library, of people absorbing books, of people picking up ideas and figuring out what to do with them. When we would write at the tables for timed writing, nobody would speak. And it was the most glorious thing, because here are these people writing as fast as they can, not speaking, not trying to make an impression, they're just writing. So that gives me the sense that in the silence of the mind, there's a place for creativity, but it has to be given a place to operate in.
That kind of comes right back to what we talked about at the beginning of, like, everything informing our work. And in that silence, you can draw on that body of knowledge, that body of experience. That's really lovely, Jack.
Well, you know, let me just say something about,
of course.
I listened to the interview that you did with Claire when you brought out Blue Moon, Blood on a Blue Moon. And what I heard in your work was a simplicity that was so clear and so beautiful. And the way you read it was actually onomatopoeic. I mean, it was, but it was silent. And yet what I know is you're a sailor, you've gone around the world on boats, you know what it feels like when a boat's on the sea. So you just experientially, as well as in words, you brought that into that novel. And that's what we have to do, you see. Now, okay, that's okay, enough. I see some questions.
No, that's great. So I was going to ask Claire if you could come back on, and Janet Oakley has a direct question to Jack, and maybe you could ask that of him.
Sure.
I would be happy to. This has just been so interesting to listen to. I thank you both for this great conversation. It's so much food for thought. So our friend Janet Oakley has a last question for you, Jack. She says, did you have specific things that you wanted to say, and did you meet your goal in writing this book?
Okay, I have to go a little bit. I said I wasn't going to do this, but I'm going to do it. I wrote the essays over a period of a year, 2 a week, at writing practice, writing 45 minutes at a time. But I had a history of writing essays because of my work with a small magazine. I wrote a 50-page novella every 3 months. I wrote the introductions, and I had a bunch of essays. The World Out of Whack, The Strong Man, the Last War. I put those all together. I was going to, put those essays in this book, but I sent it to my friend Dennis Must, and he said, no, the front essays, all of that year's writing is a unit. It's complete. These other things you have written, they're fine, but they don't belong here. So in that sense, I set out to write a book that was not a prescription on how to get wise, or even books to read to get wise, but simply a way of questioning what in the world we're doing with our minds. Are we getting so stupid that we will eat rhinoceros horn? And I just had to put that in there, you see. I mean, your toenails and rhinoceros horn are keratin. So if you're a male and you have sexual dysfunction, erectile dysfunction, why not just clip your toenails and grind them up instead of killing a rhinoceros? You see, stupid is stupid. And we're so overwhelmed with stupidity that I actually had to write about it. So Janet, yes, I met the goal and then some, but fortunately Dennis Muss has a better creative mind than I, so I did not include certain work under his tutelage.
Well, we actually got one more question in. Do you mind? Do you mind answering one more question?
Absolutely.
And then
I talk all day,
Oh, Jess, did you want to add something on?
No, after the question.
Okay.
Fine. Yeah.
Okay. So Victoria Dorper's in the audience, and she has an interesting thing to say and to ask. Silence and voice are interesting contrasts. What are your thoughts on the difference between the meaning of silence and voice for men versus women? Or do you think that there is a difference?
Well, that's a very deep question given our time.
It is.
Is there such a
It's an interesting one, though.
Yeah, well, yes. Is there such a thing as women writing or male writing? Victoria, this is kind of an obtuse way of getting to it. When I wrote Gabriela and the Widow, people asked me, how can a man write this novel? I did not think as I read it that a man could have gotten this close to women. And so what I found in Gabriela and the Widow is, and I don't know how else to say this, I found the Gabriela in me, which was written in a woman's voice. So the voice is in my words, but it's in her voice, you see. And so I don't think there are female words and male words, but I do know that there are time verbs and time nouns, and those things all present certain characteristics to the writing. If the writing is pure, and what is pure? Well, who wrote Leonard Elmore? He says, don't use any ly adverbs. He says, maybe you can get one in every 100,000 pages. And yet women, and I'm going to say this, and you can stone me if you want, but remember, I also wrote Citadel. All right. Women tend to soften their presentations. They tend to use verbs that soften up the interaction. Men, on the other hand, tend to be kind of bullheaded and stupid and write very gonadal stuff. And there's not much left that we can do with that. What we are discovering in women's writing is another way to approach the whole question of structure of story, how to handle silence in woman's language. And that's not pejorative. I mean, that I see that every day. I see it in the way Jessica writes. I see it in the way Pam Carter writes in her poetry. I see it in the way that Janet wrote Tree Soldier. She was telling a man's story, but there's a woman in it, and the woman is in the story as thick and deep as the men are. So there's no reason why you have to exclude one or the other. Now, Victoria, tell me, raise your hand if that's an answer. I don't know.
Well, you're going to have to take up a private conversation on that one.
All right. All right.
Pretty deep. I just want to kind of close here with Claire and with you, and thank you, Claire, and thank you, Village Books, for this opportunity, because honestly, Jack, you are one of the finest teachers I have ever worked with, and I just can't imagine my writing growing without your help. So thank you so much.
Thank you. That's a very compliment. I don't handle compliments well. I taught my granddaughter how to handle compliments. If somebody says, "Oh, I just love your hair," she says, "Huh," and then walks away.
Well,
but you don't have to, So anyway, I tend not to relish compliments, but I thank you for that. I hope that there are a lot of people listening who have worked with me and Bob, who have some idea that there's something beyond. You know, you can write something beyond. You go deep, you get to the goddess voice, you go beyond the goddess voice. If you're writing heroic, you go beyond the heroic voice. You go beyond the I, the pronoun I, into the seeing I, and go deeper. And that's how art is salvation. And one last note that I would add there, as we have said many, many times, art is in the rewrite. You know, if you say, oh, I wrote this on the bus coming over here and I want to read it now, I say, go home. I don't want to read it. I don't want to hear it. You know, I want to hear work that has been taken as deep as the mind can take it. You know, we're the only primates who can speak and write. As I said before, there is no history of pigeonry written by a pigeon, and no history of primates written by a primate except us. We're the only ones can do it. Honor those words, honor the writing, let the writing explode into new domains, so to speak. In the book, there's that wonderful quote by Pensée Pascal. He said, "Combien de royaumes nous ignorent? How many kingdoms know nothing about us, that we even exist?" See, that's a very profound question. What
Jack,
have you not given us in your writing? See, go ahead. I'm sorry.
well, I'm just going to say we could go on and on, but
Yes.
actually we can't go on and on. So there's the book.
So here's the book, everybody. And I do want to say that there is a lot of love happening in the chat right now, which I did open back up. People who have worked with you, Jack, and been inspired by you, saying thank you, saying this was all fascinating. So here is the book. I have put in the chat the link to the Village Books website, where the page where both of our authors, most of their books are listed and available for purchase. We do thank those of you who went ahead and purchased a copy of What Do I Know at registration. Your books are en route to you. We do have autographed book plates now. They're going to arrive separately because the books went out before we had the autographed book plates. But if you do order from Village Books, we will provide you with autographed book plates from Jack. So just follow that link and support an independent bookstore. And gosh, thank you both for this great conversation. It was lovely. And of course, this will be available, this recorded event will be available on YouTube. So you can go to our YouTube channel and watch it over and over again.
What a challenge that is. Yeah.
Really?
Any final words from our authors today?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, everybody at Village Books, for making this possible. Especially thanks to Lisa Daly at the press. That's
Sidekick Press, yes.
Sidekick Press.
See, yeah, I mean, she was so wonderful. You know, we sat down, well, we Zoomed one day and we went over word by word by word. She said, "Do you really want to say this?" And half the time I said no. So she had an eye for what I was trying to get to and helped me get to it. So I appreciate that very much.
And she is in the audience. So that's a shout out to Lisa Daly.
Well,
hi,
good.
Lisa.
Yeah.
So
thank you to you, Claire.
This was my pleasure. My pleasure. I enjoyed it. We got to do this. When was that? When was your event, Jess? It just seems all
April.
April. Yeah, that was great fun. And it's nice to see you both here. And again, there's the book. It's beautiful.
Right.
And and thank you, everyone. I think on that, we will say good afternoon.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.